So, ethical development and augmentation in Stoicism is a major theme. For the Stoics, ethical development is intertwined and interconnected and coupled with ideas of virtue, happiness, nature, and indifference. And so, recall that for the Stoics, there is only one good, and that is virtue, and that virtue is the only prerequisite to happiness. This is different from, say, the Aristotelian approach, which says that virtue is the most important good. However, there are other goods out there, such as prosperity, health, and the well-being of family. But the Stoics take a more extreme approach in the sense that they say that the only good is virtue, and the only prerequisite to happiness is that virtue. So, in terms of ethical development, we may contrast the Stoic approach or the Stoic perspective on the pattern of ethical development with that of the Platonic Aristotelian perspective. Now, in the Platonic Aristotelian perspective, they suggest that ethical development is a combination of different things, largely inborn nature, as well as habituation of attitudes and emotions. And lastly, the rationalization and the intellectualization of matters, so whether through education or otherwise, formal education or otherwise. So it's an intellectual and rational education that comes as the latter phase, which is the logos. The habituation is the ethos. The habituation in beliefs, attitudes, and emotions is the ethos. And then the inborn nature is the idea that some people are born with a natural tendency for ethical development that is greater than others. Now, the Stoics take a different approach. Their approach is based on universality and naturalness. I'll discuss that in a bit. But to delve further into the Platonic Aristotelian approach, what I want to say is that the Platonic Aristotelian approach basically says that ethical development happens through two phases. And these two phases are the habituative phase, guided at training emotions and attitudes, followed by the rational or the theoretical phase aimed at producing ethical understanding or knowledge. And so the Stoic pattern of ethical development differs from this Platonic Aristotelian perspective. As I said earlier, the Stoics focus on universality and naturalness. They believe that every human being has an inborn natural tendency for ethical development, largely irrespective of social and political contexts. So the Stoics argue that all human beings have a starting point of virtue. And such a starting point is in part what the Stoics call preconceptions, which refers to the inborn capacity for the conceptions of fundamental ideas of ethics, such as caring for oneself and others. So in addition, the Stoic perspective is that ethical development can occur in any social or political context. I'll delve into that more in a bit. But thus, for the Stoics, ethical development can occur irrespective of the social and political context, as the capacity to develop ethically is ingrained as the natural makeup of a human being. Now, the Platonic Aristotelian perspective is different. They say that social and political contexts play a significant role, certainly much more significant than in the perspective or in the way that the Stoics see things. And so, for the Platonic Aristotelian perspective, the development of virtue and happiness is dependent on a combination of both external and internal factors. And so thus, external factors such as social and political contexts are emphasized in the perspectives of Plato and Aristotle. Now, the Stoics also give a nod to that. They also suggest that there are influences, such as familial influences and social contexts, that can affect the pattern of ethical development for a human being. But what they say is that human beings have an ability to distinguish those negative and positive influences from one another, because they have this innate natural ability for ethical development and for virtue. So, as the Stoics see things, human beings have an innate ability to distinguish the positive and negative influences from one another. That is, the positive and negative influences from family or social contacts or political contacts. And in so doing, they attain a grasp of virtue and happiness irrespective of those external contacts. Remember that for the Stoics, a big part of Stoic theory is externals or indifferences. Epictetus in his writings uses precisely the term externals as a substitute for indifferences. But for the Stoics, ethical development is a natural process for the human being. And so that is, it is not as the Platonic Aristotelian perspective, which suggests that there is a combination of inborn nature, some kind of a special ability, that some human beings have for ethical development, as well as habituative upbringing, and lastly, intellectual education that guide the pattern of ethical development. So the Stoics see things differently from the Platonic Aristotelian perspective, in the sense that they have a universality and a naturalistic approach to ethical development, or to their perspective or lens on ethical development. And they see that human beings have a natural tendency, a natural inborn ability for ethical development that is largely irrespective and detached from social and political contexts. And so these are the differences on ethical development between the Stoic approach and the Platonic Aristotelian perspective.